talk a lot about the Queen's relationship with Harry and Meghan in the book. And before we get into the stories that you tell in this, I mean, how do we know that what you're saying is the truth in terms of their relationship? Because there are a lot of people watching this programme who obviously you don't have the Queen to talk to about this for the book, but how do we know that the stories that people have told you are correct and that the people that you speak to actually do have a relationship with the Queen?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but you'll have to trust me to some extent. I'm afraid, resort to what that famous expression, private information. So I don't want to particularly reveal my sources.
If things behind the scenes aren't great, and when you talk about in the book about, the depth of feeling towards, Harry and Meghan when they got together and after the marriage, I can imagine it wasn't an easy situation for them to try and work within if there was animosity from the inside.
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated to find such an advocate for these two, because
I'm doing is I'm playing devil's advocate.
Okay, well,
because I think it's important to have a
she turned a lot of people against her very quickly, and she was extremely rude to staff. I mean, I know for a fact that one time she was rude to one of the undergardeners, and the Queen had to go and tick her off for being rude to the staff.
They'd be hugely surprised if there isn't a single member of the royal family historically who's never been rude to a member of staff before. I just think you can pull things out with the assumption that no one's ever had that behaviour ever before.
Well, most people seem to say that Prince Andrew was rude to every single member of staff that he ever came.
And we've had that conversation before. Yeah. So I think to choose that as a thing to, choose that stick to beat them with, I don't necessarily think is a very strong stick. But I'm glad we had.
So, you just saw that. And before we go anywhere else, before we analyze, before we unpack, before we do what we're about to do, just sit with what you witnessed for a moment. Because what just happened on that screen was not a heated argument, was not a dramatic confrontation, was not the kind of television moment that arrives with swelling music and visible tension and people talking over each other in the way that passes for debate in most media environments. It was quieter than that, and considerably more devastating. What you just watched was the royal commentary machine, the industry, the apparatus, the self-sustaining ecosystem of books and interviews and panel appearances and unnamed sources and insider accounts that has been operating, largely without serious challenge, for years, encounters something it was not prepared for. A simple question. Not an accusation, not a counter-narrative, not an emotional rebuttal or a passionate defense, or any of the tools that can be dismissed as bias or loyalty, or the response of someone who has already made up their mind. Just a question. Where is your proof? 4 words. And suddenly, the whole thing started coming apart at the seams. Let's establish, clearly, and at the outset, exactly what kind of industry we are talking about, because understanding the ecosystem is essential to understanding why that question, that basic, foundational, entirely reasonable journalistic question, had the effect it had. The royal commentary industry is, at its functional core, a content business. It produces books, articles, television appearances, podcast episodes, social media content, speaking engagements, all of it organized around the same fundamental promise: access, insider knowledge, the truth about what is really happening inside the most famous, most scrutinized, most symbolically loaded family in the world. The promise is seductive because the family is genuinely fascinating to a large global audience, and because the institution has, by design and by tradition, maintained a level of opacity that creates genuine public curiosity about what actually happens behind the walls. People want to know. The curiosity is real, and the industry exists to serve that curiosity, or more precisely, to monetize it. The problem, the structural, foundational, everything else flows from this problem, is that genuine access to the inner workings of that family is extraordinarily limited. The people who are actually present for the conversations, the relationships, the tensions, the private moments that the books claim to describe in such vivid detail, those people almost never speak on the record. They have legal obligations and professional incentives and personal loyalties that prevent them from providing the kind of attributable, verifiable, on-the-record testimony that responsible journalism requires. So the industry operates, almost entirely, on unnamed sources, on people familiar with the situation, on friends who asked not to be identified, on palace insiders whose relationship to the palace cannot be verified and whose account cannot be checked against any independent record. A chain of citations so circular and so self-referential that if you follow it all the way around, you end up reliably back at the same place you started. Someone said something, someone else repeated it, and now it has been repeated enough times that it has acquired the texture of established fact. This is the machine, and Charlene just walked into it with a wrench. She didn't shout. This is worth emphasizing because it is part of what made the moment so effective and so revealing. She didn't attack. She didn't bring an agenda that was visible from the opening frame of the conversation. She didn't arrive with the energy of someone who had already written their conclusion and was looking for supporting evidence. She did something that every journalist is theoretically trained to do, and that this particular genre of commentary has been allowed to avoid doing for a remarkably long time. She applied scrutiny. How do we know this is true?
That's the question, in its simplest, most direct, most stripped of everything extraneous form. The question that is supposed to be asked of every claim, every source, every assertion presented as fact. The question that sits at the foundation of the entire enterprise of journalism as a discipline rather than as a content production strategy. And the response? A retreat into language that sounds authoritative while communicating nothing verifiable. Private information. Let's spend a moment with this phrase because it is doing extraordinary work and deserves to be examined carefully rather than accepted at face value. Private information sounds like the language of exclusivity. It implies access. It suggests that the speaker is in possession of something genuine, something real, something obtained through proximity to the truth rather than distance from it. It performs credibility even as it declines to demonstrate it. But translate it into plain English. Strip away the framing, ignore the tone, look only at what it actually communicates, and you get something considerably less impressive. I cannot show you my evidence. That's it. That's the full informational content of the phrase. And in any context where claims are being made about real people, whose reputations are being shaped by those claims, I cannot show you my evidence is not an acceptable answer. It is not acceptable in a court of law. It is not acceptable in academic research. It is not acceptable in investigative journalism. It is not acceptable in any professional context where the standard for making claims about other people's behavior, motivations, and private lives involves something more than the word of someone who declines to be identified by someone who declines to explain the nature of the access. It should not be acceptable in royal commentary. And Charlene's question made that unacceptability visible on live television in front of an audience that included people who had been accepting it for years. Then came the undergardener. And here I want to give this particular moment the full attention it deserves, because it is, and I say this with complete sincerity, one of the most perfectly illustrative examples of how this industry operates that I have ever encountered. We have spent years being told, with the gravity and the authority of people who are claiming insider access to one of the world's most powerful institutions, that Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, was unkind to staff.
This claim has appeared in books, in articles, in panel discussions, in the kind of authoritative, serious, this is a matter of record framing that implies documentation, implies multiple sources, implies the kind of sustained, verified pattern of behavior that would justify the conclusion being drawn. And, when pressed, when the specific, basic, foundational question of what exactly are we talking about was asked, we got an undergardener. A vague, unspecified, entirely unverifiable anecdote about an undergardener. No name, no date, no context, no corroborating account, no explanation of how this information was obtained, who provided it, what their relationship to the situation was, or why we should accept their characterization of an interaction they may or may not have witnessed, described to a source who may or may not have been present, relayed to an author who has declined to identify them. Just an undergardener. And this is the evidence on which a significant portion of the Meghan is difficult narrative rests. Not all of it, but this particular strand, this particular thread, which has been woven through repetition and confidence and the institutional weight of being published and discussed and treated as credible, into something that functions as established fact in certain conversations. An undergardener. The gap between the authority of the claim and the quality of the evidence supporting it is not a gap. It is a chasm. It is the kind of distance that in any context where rigorous standards are applied would result in the claim being withdrawn pending verification. In this context, it had been in circulation for years. Charlene's response to this was to point out something that, once said, cannot be unsaid, that sits so obviously on the surface of the conversation that its continued non-presence prior to this moment tells you as much about the environment as anything else. Are we really, seriously, with straight faces, going to pretend that unkindness to staff has been a Meghan-specific phenomenon within this institution? In a family, in an institution defined by hierarchy, centuries old, built on a structure that places some people at the center of all consideration and others at the periphery by design, with documented, on-the-record, named and attributed accounts of behavior towards staff, toward employees, toward people in service roles that have generated legal proceedings and settlements, and the kind of detailed, verifiable, sourced reporting that the undergardener story has never come close to resembling.
We're going to choose the undergardener as our evidence of a character problem, the selective application of concern, the way that an unverifiable anecdote about one person becomes a defining narrative, while substantially more documented behavior from others gets minimized, contextualized, excused, or simply not discussed with equivalent intensity, is not an accident. It is the mechanism. It is how narratives get constructed and maintained in ways that serve particular purposes while appearing to be driven by genuine accountability. Accountability that applies to everyone equally is journalism. Accountability that applies to one person with unique intensity while letting others off the hook consistently is something else, something with an agenda, something that should be asked about. And Charlene asked about it. Watch what happens when the evidence question doesn't get answered satisfactorily, because the response is revealing in ways that go beyond the specific exchange. The argument doesn't strengthen. There is no pivot to better evidence, no production of clearer sourcing, no acknowledgement that the question is legitimate and the answer is currently insufficient. The argument shifts, deflects, looks for different ground. And specifically, and this is the move that deserves to be named clearly, it attempts to reframe the questioner. Suddenly, asking for evidence is not basic journalistic practice. It's bias. It's partisanship. It's taking sides. It's the response of someone who is defending Meghan, rather than simply applying the same standard to this claim that any responsible thinker should apply to any claim. This is a rhetorical technique with a long history and a specific function. Its function is to make scrutiny feel like an attack, to make the demand for evidence feel like the problem rather than the absence of evidence, to shift the conversation from the claim doesn't hold up to the person questioning the claim has an agenda. It almost works. In environments where this technique has been deployed successfully before, where the culture of the conversation allows certain claims to exist above scrutiny, it can work well enough to change the subject and move on. It didn't work here, because Charlene had something that made it very difficult to dismiss: consistency. She wasn't being selectively skeptical. She wasn't applying scrutiny to this claim while accepting others uncritically. She was applying the same standard across the board. Show me the evidence. Which is not a partisan position. It is the only defensible position for anyone who takes seriously the responsibility of making claims about real people in public spaces. Here is the broader thing that this exchange illuminates, the thing that extends beyond this specific conversation into the shape of the entire information environment we inhabit. Confidence is not credibility. This is perhaps the most important media literacy lesson of the current era, and it is one that the royal commentary industry has depended, financially and institutionally, on people not internalizing. A person can speak with complete confidence about something they cannot verify, can write with authority about events they did not witness, can describe the interior emotional states of people they have never met, the dynamics of conversations they were not present for, the motivations behind decisions they had no part in, with the fluid assurance of an eyewitness. And none of that confidence constitutes evidence. The confidence is a performance, a very effective, very practiced, very convincing performance, but a performance. And the moment someone asks for what lies underneath the performance, the actual evidence, the verifiable sourcing, the documented basis for the claims, the performance either produces substance or it doesn't. In this case, it didn't, and the watching audience had an opportunity in real time to see the gap between the confidence and the evidence, to experience with their own eyes the distance between how certain a claim sounded and how little it rested on when pressure was applied. That's a valuable experience, not because it changes everything immediately, but because once you have seen that gap exist, you start looking for it everywhere. You start noticing when confidence is substituting for evidence, when authority of tone is doing the work that authority of substance should be doing, when the story sounds compelling right until the moment you ask a basic question.
And here is the irony that sits at the center of this entire conversation and that deserves to be named directly. The people who write these books, who make these claims, who describe private conversations and interior emotional states and behind-the-scenes dynamics with the detailed confidence of participants, these are the same people who criticize Harry and Meghan for speaking publicly about their own experiences, for writing a memoir, for making a documentary, for giving an interview, for using their own voices to describe their own lives from their own perspective. The criticism of Harry and Meghan for speaking is that it's inappropriate, that it violates some code of discretion, that private matters should remain private. But the people making this criticism are, at the same moment, writing books about private matters, describing private conversations, claiming insider knowledge of private relationships, speculating about private motivations. The difference, apparently, is that Harry and Meghan are speaking about their own lives, and the commentators are speaking about someone else's. With unnamed sources, without verification, and somehow the second version, which involves less firsthand knowledge, less direct experience, and less accountability, is supposed to be more credible. Apply any consistent standard, and this does not hold together. But consistency, as we have established, is not the operating principle of this particular ecosystem. Here is where this lands. Something is shifting. Not overnight,
not completely, not in a way that immediately transforms the output of an industry that has significant financial incentives to continue operating as it always has, but in the audience, in the accumulating number of people who have watched exchanges like this one and come away with a different relationship to the claims they encounter, who have seen the confident assertion meet the basic question and watched it struggle, who have noticed the pattern: unmaimed sources, unverifiable details, selective application of scrutiny, confident tone substituting for documented evidence, and can no longer encounter it without noticing it. That audience is growing, and moments like this one accelerate its growth. Because what Charlene did was not particularly complicated or particularly radical. She asked for evidence. She applied consistent scrutiny. She refused to accept the reframing of basic journalistic practice as partisan behavior. She did what the conversation has needed someone to do for a very long time. And the response to her doing it, the deflection, the shift, the attempt to reframe the questioner rather than answer the question, confirmed, more effectively than any counter-argument could, that the question needed asking. If the claim were solid, it would welcome scrutiny. If the sourcing were genuine, it would survive questions. If the narrative were built on substance, one simple 4-word question would not cause it to wobble. But it did wobble, right there on live television in front of everyone watching. And once you've seen something wobble, you start noticing how much else is wobbling too. That's not the end of the story, but it might be the beginning of a different kind of audience, one that asks questions, one that demands evidence, one that understands that confidence is a performance and credibility is something else entirely, and one that, having watched one simple question unravel years of unchallenged narrative, is no longer willing to accept the claim without the proof. It's about time. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.